And good afternoon, everyone. This is Mary Messicomer from Sourcewell Technology. I'm also the current administrator of the Minnesota Learning Commons Partnership. And today we have with us my friend Glen Irvin, who is a very experienced podcast developer and host in K-12 education. And I will let Glen talk more about himself in just a second. And our contact information is in here if you'd like to follow the OnEducation Podcast, which Glen helps to run on Twitter. There's the Twitter handles there, and Glen's Twitter handle is there also, along with my own. And we also have a Twitter handle for the Minnesota Learning Commons. So Glen, if you want to go ahead and just start talking to us a little bit about your views on podcasts and how you came to get started and the value that you see podcasts having.
I think I'll start with just kind of the origin, because I want to admit to everyone that when Mike Washburn, my co-host, approached me at a Schoology Next conference in Chicago. I had just presented on gamification. He was in my session, and I didn't really know Mike. He says that I did know him, but I don't remember. I never had met him in real life, and I don't remember him from Twitter or anything. But anyway, he came up to me and he just started in on a conversation like we had been friends for years, and I was like, I don't even know who this guy is, but whatever, you're at a conference, you're all excited, whatever. And almost right away when we barely had met, he had an idea. He said, "Hey, I think we should do this a podcast together." And at that point in my life, the only podcasts I had ever listened to were for my Spanish class, and I had used. There's some really, really good podcasts that are great conversational Spanish podcasts where it teaches you kind of some thematic things. You're at a restaurant, you're this, and we used to listen to them in class. But I didn't listen to podcasts. I wasn't into that or whatever it might be, and I sure didn't know that there was people in education, kind of doing this. But I have to give it 100% of the credit to Mike, who approached me with that, and then I quickly forgot about that that conversation. That a few months later, he actually reached out to me with a plan, basically, of like, here's what we would be talking about, here's what we would be doing, etc. And he had a really well thought out outline as far as the way that's even it's very close to what we still do today. The original outline that he had come up with as far as kind of what we do at the beginning and then kind of the transitions that take place. Very few things have changed from the beginning. So he really had thought that out. And now it's, almost 200 episodes in as far as into the podcast, and I can't believe it. I honestly didn't even know Mike, from anybody, whatever it might be. And it was actually really interesting. If you listen to the first, I would say at least 10 episodes of the podcast, we didn't really even know each other at that time. We had met at one conference for a little bit of time. And then now we were like, thrust into this situation where we were interviewing guests. And some of our guests, right from the beginning, we had Rafranz Davis. We had Paul Darbasi, like almost right from the beginning. I actually knew Paul. I didn't know Rafranz. I knew of her, but we had some like big time.
Yeah.
And we had to
Glenn,
pretend.
Just for the purposes of our audience, do you want to just mention a little bit about who Rafranz is and what she does, and
Yes.
Just give some
Absolutely
context to that. And then the other thing I would just mention is one of my first ones that I listened to of yours, I heard the author Jordan Shapiro and
Yes.
developed a super bad professional crush on him. So I follow everything he does now. So anyway, so go ahead and keep going.
Yeah. So I knew of Rafranz just because she, at that point in time, as far as in the edu Twitter space, let's just call it, what it was then, and this was probably, I want to say about 5 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago. I would say she was one of the biggest, I don't want to call her names out there, but really a person that you could go ahead and follow and learn so much from. That's a good way of being able to describe her. She was and still currently is a director of technology of some sort in Texas. And she continues to be a voice, an advocate for our students, for underserved communities, and just an amazing person. And so I was super intimidated right from the beginning. I was like, my goodness, we this is real now. And so it kind of got thrust, like we were right in the thing. We were doing episodes every single week. And so we did have to learn very quickly, basically. So I didn't come into it with any knowledge about what podcasts were and how to produce them. Right from the beginning, we were recording the podcast and we were editing them ourselves. We had the opportunity also, another pressure opportunity happened. I knew some people at Schoology and they were interested in sponsoring the podcast. And again, small podcasts that have never put out an episode with names that nobody knows usually don't get sponsors. And so Schoology comes in and basically says they'll fund our podcast and basically buy all of our equipment and be our sponsor for the year. And they wrote out a significant check to us and said, here you go, and go ahead and go for it. We hadn't even put out an episode yet. We didn't even have the episode 0, the demo episode. So again, a lot of pressure was on us, and but it was great. It was like, okay, this is really going to happen. So it was super exciting. And one of the first things, and the thing that sold me, that Mike told me right from the beginning, was we were going to have those honest conversations that need to be had in public about education. So we weren't going to dodge things that were, quote unquote, controversial or things that were, scary to talk about. And I was up for that. I was like, there's a lot of things, as I have been heavily involved in the teachers union, and I love to read about educational topics, not just technology, but just topics in general. So I was like, this is something that I'm really passionate about, and Mike was super passionate, and we had this, and we continue to have this. Though we agree on some ideas, we come from very different perspectives. He's Canadian. I grew up in the Southwest, and we just have these, even though we agree on a lot of ideas, there's a lot of different things that I've learned from him. And I would say that he probably would say he's learned from me just talking to each other. So even just those conversations are really good too. And they have created a great space for people to come listen to the podcast, enjoy it, right? And then also get to bring those topics of conversations to their colleagues and start having those professional conversations. It's not that we're providing the answers, for all any of these types of things. It's that we're bringing the topics to light, and then we want people to then continue those conversations. And even as Mike says several times and has throughout many episodes, it's okay to challenge us and not agree with us, because that's okay. That's actually a good thing. It's the discussions that are had and that we can grow from. And I think that elevates the profession. And I think that's one of the first topics that we were going to talk about, Mary, is what about podcasts and the value of that in professional development?
Right.
I think it's huge. And I was missing out, previous to now I'm a fan of podcasts outside of, my own. I listen to tons of podcasts and tons of educational podcasts because it helps me to grow as a professional. I feel like I'm in the know of what's currently happening throughout the country and even throughout the world in education, and it helps me to grow in my own profession, in my current role as an instructional coach. I guess I never even introduced myself, but as I dove right into the thing, but
That's
Previous
okay.
to becoming an instructional coach, I was a Spanish teacher for 20 years. And I grew up in El Paso, Texas. I was born in El Paso, and had the opportunity to teach in California and in Colorado. And then we ended up moving to Wabasha, Minnesota, and southeastern Minnesota.
Okay.
We were there for quite a while. I want to say 12 years of my career were actually in Wabasha, previous to moving here to the Sartell, St. Cloud area. And I teach I'm an instructional coach in Sauk Rapids. But yeah, that whole getting to share those things and those experiences and then getting to talk about that and then bring on our guests. I think that was a great idea by Mike, is bring on guests that bring value to the listeners and then be able to ask them and bring to light some of those great topics of a variety platter of things that we've talked about with the guests.
Yes.
And really it does help. Like each time I leave one of the interviews, I'm just like, I bet my wife gets tired of this, but I always leave on Monday nights. We record our things and I go up to the bedroom and then I have a debriefing with her about what we just finished talking about with the guests, because I'm so excited about what I've learned and what was shared. Everything from ed tech stuff to topics on equity to everything else in between. I mean, there's just been quite a variety of different guests on the podcast, and it's super exciting still. I mean, we just had an interview this past Monday, and it was again the same thing. I bet my wife's getting tired of me, though she's an English teacher too, so she's in the know too. And I after that interview, I was like again excited about some of the topics that were brought to light by the guests, and I'm like, this is something new. This is something exciting. So I think there's something very valuable as far as having podcasts associated with professional development. And I know in some districts, they actually are able to use, sites like Wakelets, I think, to be able to associate a podcast and what you learn from it and reflections to be able to earn, CEUs, for example.
CEUs.
Exactly. Or some other types of credits to be able to go up on salary grids. But more than that, when you start getting into a podcast, and especially an educational, when you're an educator, it's really awesome because you can put it on, and that's the reason why podcasts are probably so popular, is you can listen to them anytime, in your car, while you're exercising. I do it while I'm cleaning the house, and it's something you can obviously take in, and you can still do something else on the side versus a video, like what we're doing right now, where you are you're kind of stuck here. But with the podcast, you can kind of take it on the go. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're so popular. And I think that's why a lot of districts are allowing for that type of professional development to take place.
I actually love that idea that a teacher would be able to find some podcasts in higher education as well as K-12, find some podcasts that they find useful and do some reflection and capture some learning from those. I think that's using Wakelet or any kind of tool, notes, whatever, I think is an amazing use of this medium. And I would totally agree with you. What I love about them, I was not into them so much when podcasts first came out. It was like, yeah, it's kind of like listening to the radio, but they kind of went away for a while and then they came back and more people were doing them. And I'm with you. I started to discover this idea that, oh my gosh, there's people out there talking about education and other things that are important to me. And the idea that I can absorb some of the viewpoints and knowledge of some of these speakers that are out there who've been working in education for a long time and have some great insights in my own time when it works for me too. So I just really like that. And I do them when I'm out taking my walks, or sometimes even if I'm working at my computer, I might play one while I'm doing something that doesn't require a ton of concentration. So that's a really good point, Glenn.
And I think some people are using them too. And this is a really good idea. When I just saw that, Cindy, that you posted that about personalized learning. they're using that as one of the many options for educators to go ahead and choose the things that are good for them at the moment as far as for professional development is concerned. So you have like 3 or 4 hours or whatever that you need to go ahead and fulfill. Maybe one of those hours is a choice hour, and you can listen to a podcast and take a walk outside, and then have a discussion with your colleagues. Is maybe like the assignment or whatever it might be to be able to fulfill that. Those things are great, and if you can build that kind of culture within your school or your district, as far as this culture of wanting to go ahead and, the growth mindset and wanting to go ahead and continue to learn and bring new ideas and have those discussions, man, that's awesome. That fires me up, and that's why I get all super excited, when we have on our guests and they bring their ideas. I think that was kind of one of our next topics too that we were going to talk about is how do we choose the guests that end up coming onto the podcast. At first, I'll be very candid with you. I was on Twitter and I messaged hundreds of people that I thought would make great guests.
Cast a wide net.
Yes, I was like, I think these people would make great podcast guests, and some of them, many people, got back to us, and we started being able to fill the schedule, and now we get guests from a variety of different things. People are they reach out to us because they come from, someone recommends someone, or and says, oh, you should talk to whoever, they'd be a great guest. So we talk to them, and then they end up coming onto the podcast. We have an association with both FETC and ISTE, and we have the great opportunity and privilege of being able to interview their keynote speakers and their guests and or their presenters, kind of like their big presenters. So and I mean, what an opportunity. Anybody that's going to speak at these things, and not everybody gets to go to FETC or to ISTE, but to be able to bring those guests and share those ideas with our audience, hey, that's fantastic, because that's kind of what we do. We say, we talk about what it is that they are passionate about and what they usually present about, and we even have them share kind of insight into what they're going to talk about even before they go in and do it, so that our audience can get at least some connection with those type of speakers. They're always amazing people. So and those things just happened, as we went through this process, and as we went through the last few years, like little by little, FETC was always super open to us. We proposed some things to them and said, hey, we'd like to podcast directly from the conference, and they kind of looked at us weird. We're like, no, we think it'd be
really,
great.
people
We could
do
interview
this.
some guests here, and we could do some different things. And they just were, they looked at us weird, but then they were like, okay, what do you need? We're like, we just need a table. And we literally, one year at FETC a few years ago, I printed out a large piece of paper from our poster printer here in my media center, and we laid it on a table and had our OnEducation thing, and we had a microphone that was kind of like this microphone that I'm using, like these little blue snowball ones, except it might have been a Yeti, and we just set it on the table and we had these interviews, and it was awesome. I mean, that was like our first, kind of dive into that, and ever since then, they had such positive feedback about that we were then invited not only to come back, but then they actually gave us some space and started doing some different things for us or whatever it might be. And so it's really been great, really well received. And again, we're blessed to have had all of those different opportunities.
And we had you do that similar thing at our
Yes.
our own Sourcewell Technology. I don't remember if we were still under the TIES name then or not, but our own Impact Education Conference, we had you come and be our podcasters of note and do that same thing. And that was, just a great way to connect people at the conference too. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, Mary, of, I mean, for us that are a little bit older, it does remind me of radio, like
Yep.
that's that kind of live radio shows that used to take place. You know, I think they still do, but you know, radio's a little bit gone by the wayside. But in this case, it's kind of like you couldn't go to the Impact Education Conference for whatever reason. You know, there's tons of reasons why we can't attend things,
Hmm.
but it feels great when you can just listen to in and feel the atmosphere of the conference and kind of get a 5 to 10 minutes insight into a presenter's topic, into something that is a hot educational topic right now, a discussion, you know, something, whatever it might be. And I think that's what the listeners really do enjoy and love.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think especially in a time right now with the pandemic, when we haven't even had live events. Well, they're live, but we do everything virtually now. So we're not getting together in person physically. And so the ability to have those connections with speakers, and I sometimes call them edu celebrities, which I mean with the greatest of respect, not being sarcastic about it all, but there's lots of amazing people out there doing wild things in education, and it's so good to be able to have a podcast like yours and Mike's where we can get to know those people and get those ideas too. So that's great.
One of the ideas I wanted to share is, and I kind of talked about a little bit about kind of the equipment that we got started with. We didn't have
Yeah.
anything, you know, we had these cheap, super cheap mics. Um, Yet that doesn't really matter in the end. And even the editing part, you know, we do some editing now, to you know, we fancy it up. Let's just go. We have intro music, we have some different things,
Mhm.
types of stuff, but you really don't need all of that stuff. And actually, all of those things are very easy to go ahead and learn how to do and be able to put together, to make it sound really good. But an idea that I would share with other districts, and a thing that I would highly recommend exploring, would be to have your own podcast within even your district. And one of the things that we were even exploring here in Sauk Rapids was really getting to know, we're such a big staff across many buildings, getting to know our own staff with little short interviews, and being able to connect with them, you know, connect
Mhm.
with staff members, and then being able to basically produce your own even in-house podcast. And again, it's not hard to do because you can record on anything. Um, but even if you had some cheap microphones like this Blue Snowball mic, um, or if you just use your laptop or even a phone to be able to record and use software like Anchor. Anchor.fm is a free software that you can go ahead and you can use to record, edit, and host your podcast, and then be able to publish it and then have it all kind of there, and it produces a link that you can go ahead and use, um, to be able to share with your audience, whoever that audience may be, even if it's just a small internal audience. It's a really easy way for you to be able to pass on a message. You know, in this case, it could be a connection between your staff. And we are exploring that idea currently. We were actually going to do it this year, but because of the pandemic, didn't make it possible. But for sure, next year, internally, we're going to definitely do that, and mostly because we want to build community and really, um, kind of lift up ourselves up and really say, hey, look at all the amazing things that are happening. Oh, and I didn't even know that this person, you know, really get to know people. It's really
Yeah.
easy to get disconnected just even in one big building like the one that I work
Mhm.
in. It's hard to get those relationships built.
Mhm.
And it's way easier when you get to hear someone's story. It's easier to connect, you know. So it's a great way to be able to go ahead and do something, to that effect without having to put a bunch of investment behind it. You know, you don't have to
Sure.
do a bunch of things. And it's in a different format than an email. As everybody knows here, probably as
Mhm.
on this call or anybody listening to this, email becomes kind of like this thing that we all hate, you know, even if it's a good message that's intended, you know, to come through. Um, it sometimes isn't the best, you know, tool to be able to pass on things, but an audio message seems like a really easy way to connect to that. even sometimes better than a video message, because
Mhm.
of, the technology needed for a video message, etc. Or just not having to be connected to this. I don't have to like look at this screen here. I can just put on my headphones, go for a walk, and be able to listen to those things. So
Yeah.
it is a unique way of being able to spread uh, the awesomeness that's happening in your districts or
Mhm.
wherever.
Yep. Well, in we have some higher education people in our audience
Mm,
too. So
yes.
I'd be curious if anybody in the office, if you regularly use, in the audience, excuse me, if you regularly listen to or use podcasts, if you have some favorites that you'd like to put in the chat, or if you're doing something with podcasting in your institution that you'd share, please go ahead and put that in the chat, or just unmute yourself and speak up at any time too. Because I have to think that this would be, especially now that we're in this, this new era of distance learning that's been going on. And I don't know that we're all going to go back to just that full-time seat time face-to-face model of education, nor should we necessarily for all
Yeah.
things. And so I'm just really wondering, Glenn, what your thoughts are in terms of doing podcasting for content for students of any age, and if you're doing any of that yourself, what insights you might have on that too.
Yeah, I actually usually just speak directly. Like educators just want to hear about that. They're
Mhm.
fine with like, hey, you have a podcast, fine. I don't really care. It's like, how can I get my kids, my students, how can I get them going on this? Or is it even possible?
Mhm.
Or is it too technical, etc. And the biggest message that I like to give to educators is you don't need much of anything except a device. I have a document here that I'm going to share, and on the top of it, it has some. It was from a session that I just did a few days ago. On the top, it has some gamification resources, so you can kind of ignore that. But there's a long list here of podcasting resources for your students, for students. So feel free to share any of this. It has ways like some examples, some great examples, even from Minnesota. Um, some examples all from elementary school all the way to high school, like the power of what can our students and how can they get their message out. There's a teacher in the St. Paul School District. His name is Jesse Buto. And Jesse is the fantastic example of what is possible. He has a fourth, fifth grade combination class. I think that's is his classes that he teaches, and the podcast that he has and produced for I think 5 or 6 years. He has seasons of this podcast with its kid produced and kid edited. Um, and it's the students that are their voices on there, and it's called This Fifth Grade Life, and it's mirrored after This
Oh,
American Life, a very popular
yeah,
podcast. And these kids are sharing stories about their families, their culture, and everything else in between. Super funny things to very serious, amazing topics that they're sharing. And they interview their family members and grandparents sometimes, and sometimes people on the phone. And they bring in things. And what Jesse has done is he's taught them kind of the magic of narrative podcasting. So This American Life is a kind of a narrative podcast. They tell stories, and he's
great.
taught them that, and there's a big connection between that, and that's what we're using even here in Sauk Rapids, the connection between telling a story in a podcast and telling a story in written form. There's a lot of connections between the two, talking
Mhm.
about an outline. How do you create a hook to draw your audience in? Same kind of concepts that you would have as far as in writing. And it's a great activity to vary, for example, journal entries. Instead of having a journal entry every
Mhm.
single day, be able to go ahead and do like a 1 or 2 minute podcast, for that your kids could produce. In groups, they could produce all kinds of different things. NPR has a contest that they run every single year. There's a 5 through 8 category and a 9 through 12 category for student podcasts of the year. And the winners of these podcasts, you should go back, you should listen to the 2020 versions of these podcasts. They're phenomenal. I mean, they'll blow you away. Um, and their students produced, edited, put together, directed, and it's their voices that are being heard and their topics that they're coming up with too. Um, and it's really easy to get going with it. That's what our teachers here really love is there's not a lot of like prep work. There's not a lot of things to learn. You don't really have to do heavy editing if you don't want to. And there's some different techniques that I talk about as far as usually, that I share as far as experiences. Like it's great to have an outline just to make sure that you hit all of the topics and the things that you want to go ahead and do, but you don't want to have everything scripted because then you're just reading. So there's like a
Right.
combination between those two things. And people don't like, unless they're listening to an amazing reader of a novel, that which you buy
Mhm.
those audiobooks, they don't really want to listen to you read something. They want to listen to you talk, to speak, and have a
Yeah.
conversation. They want to feel like they were there listening in on just chit chat of whatever it might be.
Hmm.
And those are the best podcasts. And
Yeah.
even passing on that message to your students and saying, okay, we still want to stay on topic and hit these things, and we want to have a certain amount of time that we want this, but have a conversation back and forth and let's fill it with, let's fill it with our content and be able to do that. There's even a link, I think, to in that list there, the document where I think the New York Times shared like 1,000 topics to be able to uh, have your students talk, make a podcast about. Um, and they're phenomenal. I mean, it's like, and it's great student-centered topics, things that they would want to go ahead and give you their opinion on and be able to share about. And that's really what you want. I mean, that's one of the when we talk about the 4 C's, the communication standard that we talk about,
Yep.
we want them to share and communicate and be able to do that for an authentic audience.
Hmm.
What better setting than to be able to do that? It's a good activity to mix it up with as far as in your classes. So it doesn't have to be the exclusive activity at all, but it's something great so that you can have your students do and share their ideas and then be able to publish it to the appropriate audience. Sometimes that's just,
Hmm.
their family members and other stakeholders, but sometimes it can be, a more global audience depending upon, permissions and high school kids versus elementary kids and so on and so forth. But um, so many different resources out there to be able to go ahead and quickly put together a podcast, publish it, and then give it to an authentic audience.
Hmm. Thanks, Glenn. I'm going to interrupt you here for just a
Sure.
second because one of our audience members, Raymond, I'm seeing your name as Raymond.
I'm sorry.
Is it
I
Raymond?
it's Raymond, and
It's
there's an
Raymond.
A
Okay.
missing. Hey,
No
Glenn.
worries. No worries. I just didn't want to call you the wrong thing either. So he says he has some things to share about his experiences and he has a few questions for us. So go ahead, Raymond.
Well, first I got to tell you, Glenn, what an inspiration! And now I'm just going to get back on the horse, so to speak, because I had started up a podcast back when we hit that pandemic mark. Everyone started going into distance learning, and at the time I was a coach in Pasco County Schools, Florida, and I was like, I've got to start getting word out to everyone. I've got to do everything I can to help this transition. So I started a podcast. My plan was initially to start one, the highlights in education, to highlight miracles in the classroom. But then this happened, and I thought, okay, so it was current trends in education. And what I found, though, when I started to push this, I started a live podcast. So of course it was an interaction live, and of course after I would have this podcast, then I would publish it so that everyone could hear what was happening in those interactions when teachers would ask questions. The thing, though, I found, though, is I had a lot of prep time. I wanted to find out how much prep time you put in prior to your podcast. I was doing my editing. I did a little bit of music in there. My background is with, as a former band director, I have that experience. But, like you said, you don't have to have those editing. You can just really put some material out there and people will start listening, and you can also affect. But how much time were you putting in to prepping for your podcast? And then the next thing is that edit process. Was there much going on in-house? And then that time frame from when you record to how long does it take to put out for everyone?
Great questions. Thank you so much. Yes. So the prep time, we have uh, these outlines that we put out each week, myself and Mike, since obviously Mike's in Canada, I'm here in Minnesota. We talk, through text message every so often, but it's usually not specifically about what we were going to talk about on the podcast. It's usually other topics, whatever it might be. We're both video game nerds, so it's usually a video game conversation. And so on the outline, though, as the week progresses, we always put on potential topics. We always throw in some potential topics that we've seen throughout the week, whether they were posted in a news source, whatever might be, a newspaper, whatever, or if they were, someone posted something controversial on Twitter and everything else in between. So we just put all these different topics throughout the week and we put them on this list. And then every Monday night is our recording night. I think it used to be on Sunday night, but it's Monday nights now. And on Monday during the day, we kind of finalize what our topics are. So we say, okay, we're going to eliminate these things and we're only going to focus on these 3 or 4 things, as far as our topics are concerned. But we also make sure that we have by Monday each develop 3 or 4 questions we can ask potentially our guests. So it's nice to have a co-host, as you probably imagine, because then you could split up some of that work. And in talking about splitting up the work, Mike is more of the like manager of the business, like of what he books all of the guests. He interacts with any of the organizations like ISTE or FETC or whoever it might be. He's interacting and having those conversations through email. And then I'm which you probably had to do all of these jobs, which I'm the editor of the podcast. So I put all of the music and edit all the stuff and do those kinds of things. I was already into that kind of stuff. I was into video editing and audio editing, and I'm a musician myself too. So I was like, yeah, I could do this. And at first, it took a really long time. Because, well, it's just a lot of learning to do. Even though you already have some experience, maybe with some editing equipment or whatever it might be, there's still, it was slow going at first as far as the editing process. But now we record on Mondays, and by Wednesday, like yesterday, I already had given Mike the finalized version of the podcast. So we turn it around very quickly, and he probably will post that. He posts it usually on Wednesday evening or Thursday. Today, sometime he'll post the actual podcast, and we just recorded on Monday. But I have heard, Raymond, of a lot of different podcasts, and I know several of them do this, is they intentionally don't talk about things that might be timely, related to a specific time period, but more generalized topics, even with their guests, so that their podcast, they could maybe record 4 or 5 episodes and then put them out every so often whenever they want to kind of plug and play them. And I have heard of podcasts that do that. So they record them whenever they can get a chance, and they may record a bunch of them and then kind of put out one a week. And it may not have been that week that they did it. Our schedule is more rigid. So we have no backup content. So there's this episode that's coming out this week. It was recorded on Monday. If something happened to either of us this week, and sometimes it has, we get sick or whatever happens, a million different things that could occur. And so we have to postpone the podcast, or we have to push it out a little bit, or whatever it might be, or guests, they can't be there on the Monday, so we might have to adjust there. But for the most part, it's worked out that we were able to record and then push it out. But I'll tell you, probably the first 20 episodes, because like I said, we're approaching 200 now. It was a process, and I listened to some of those episodes, and I'm like, God, it sounded horrible. We sound terrible. I mean, because I'm super critical of like the way that the microphone sounded, or there was an echo, or whatever else it might be. But that just, you start getting kind of perfectionist perfectionism, and you start being like, okay, this is the way it should sound or whatever. So yes, it's it's a the process is kind of we work throughout the week putting the stuff together, and it's a rough outline too. And we intentionally do that. I was a little bit paranoid of that too, because I'm more of a script reading guy. I do all of the commercials because I read scripts, from the companies. I do all those. I like scripts, and Mike is super off the cuff. But now I've become more comfortable, kind of in that environment. But he leads. If you ever listen to the podcast, he leads the conversation, so he can just talk off the cuff and see a topic, that we were going to talk, and then turn it into a question. Then I respond to it, and we kind of go back and forth a bit, and we kind of have this thing where we know now he brings up something, I comment about it, he comments back, I may laugh about it or disagree with him, and then we wrap up that topic and kind of move on to the next one. And we don't have that scripted down, but it's just become part of our, the way that we talk, kind of the way that we speak to each other. And it was really rough at the beginning though, because with two people you don't really know each other, it's those conversations can be really awkward. You don't know, you're going to interrupt each other and so on and so forth. So hopefully that answers some of your questions, Raymond.
Yeah, I wanted to share, I know that for the startup, when you were talking about even that snowball mic works well. I started, I got one of the Rode Podcaster little mixers. And then of course the Rode Podcaster mic, their mic, I just found that worked. Now I'm using that with my webinars. I'm with Eden Prairie Schools. I'm the director of EP Online. So
Yeah.
we're doing those webinars. I have not thought about some of these ideas that you were talking about within the school. I'm thinking now I'll just start doing some live podcasts and for our families with EP Online, and even getting student feedback and start going this route. And then for everyone else, I say, utilizing this with professional development. Now I'm going to get with the PL department and have some conversations, because we have amazing staff members in each of our districts that everyone should hear from and hear what's happening within. Leveraging our resources is absolutely amazing, and this is a good idea. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for your feedback. And you're exactly right. As far as the that microphone, by the way, the Rodecaster when you're talking about is fantastic. Even the one that I had right from the beginning, it was a blue mic, but it's called a Blue Yeti, and I think they're around $100. If you're wanting to record something that is able to record multiple people in the same setting, once we have post COVID and we're able to kind of get together again, you can set this microphone kind of in the middle of a table, and it does, it can record full circle or just a back and forth kind of thing. It has different settings for that. It's very cheap. It's awesome. Lots of people use that specific one. Now we're all like fancy schmancy, Mike and I, because the sponsors have bought us like Shure SM7Bs now, and we're like, we think we're we're the fancy schmancy guys because we have the super awesome, ridiculous mics. But with any of those, you can clean up the sound, you can make it sound awesome, or you can just push it out, because as long as it's not offensive, as far as, too dynamically loud or whatever it might be, you can quickly edit. And I think I put even some things in that document, might be some tutorials on how to edit with free software like Audacity, or if you have Apple related software. GarageBand is fantastic. We started with GarageBand as far as editing there. I then started moving to Audacity just because it was a little bit more dynamic. There was more things that I could actually do with it. And then of course there's a ton of paid kind of things, but free is good. And Audacity is currently the one that we use to make all of our episodes. So it must be pretty decent, I think.
I use Audacity as well, and that's what I just recommend. That just works out well. I was using it as a band director when I was doing click tracks for marching band, and I was just accustomed to it.
Yeah. I always say free is our favorite F word in education. So that's pretty great.
Absolutely.
Glenn,
Right.
I have one other kind of question for you. You spoke about having students produce podcasts and all of the different benefits of that. And Raymond just talked a little bit about having teachers in the district community make some podcasts. Have you done anything in terms of, especially now that we're in distance learning, are you using podcasts with your students in terms of content delivery, or either produced by yourself or tuning them into other podcasts for them to listen to as part of their learning experience? I'd just be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's both sides of that too, Mary. There's the what I was initially using podcasts for, which was having my students listen to podcasts because obviously it related to Spanish. I was like Spanish content, and it was easy to be able to push it out, to put it in their hands and then be able to go ahead and listen to it. And I think lots of educators do that and have probably moved more towards that, especially during these times where you might have a hybrid type of thing or a full distance type of situation. In our school district specifically, there have been a few that have used podcasts to be able to deliver content, but I think the most used way that podcasts are being used as far as in our school district is on the creative side, is letting the students create with them and giving that as an option for them to go ahead and have their voices heard. And one of the things that I always share too, and it's important for us to go ahead and note this, is there's some students who don't like video. Though it may seem like they're obsessive with video and with pictures, like visual things, Instagram or Snapchat or whatever else it might be, that they're social media things. But that's not necessarily, true for all of our students. And even in the school setting is different than the social setting, like it's for a lot of our students. So things like Flipgrid are amazing. I love Flipgrid. I love that thing. But sometimes it's okay to not have that camera pointed at my face, and I'm self-conscious of the way that I'm looking or what's in my background, etc. We've talked about those kind of things about cameras on during meetings and those types of things. So a voice is very powerful too. You don't always necessarily need this image coming through. It's great, but it's a great way to go ahead and vary it or give that option to your students to be able to go ahead and just be able to record their voice and then have that as a different way. Again, like I always talk about choice boards or whatever it might be. This may be one of those things that you do. Maybe you do it once altogether to kind of learn the processes of how does it actually go? What does it look? What do really good ones sound like? And then you always use it as an alternative assignment. Instead of doing this, you could do these types of things. And one of them may be a well-produced podcast by a group or a pair or whatever else it might be. Though you're exactly right, Mary, that you could very easily as an educator produce and deploy content to your students. I'm thinking of a variety of things you could do. And it would be a great way to be able to deliver that content to them. I'm not sure how many people take advantage of that because there's so many people that do flip instruction. They do these, or they record their screen, and then they're talking through screencasting. All fantastic. It seems like though there's some that there were maybe missing a little piece there, because you could take that content with you as a kid and do exercise and go for a walk and still be able to go ahead and get your lesson and your 10-minute lesson in a historical topic or whatever else it might be, whatever content you're actually delivering. And there's something about just audio that's powerful too.
There is something about audio, I would say, in my own experience, that I am able to focus in a different way when it's just audio. And I am, like I said, out on my walk or doing the dishes or whatever. There's just something a little bit different about not having something to watch along with that. I'm curious, Glenn, I know that when we started flipping classrooms all over the place, and I call that blended learning more often than the flipped classroom term, but I know we had a lot of recommendations about not making videos too long for students to watch or chunking up content. What are your thoughts on that when it comes to the audio, when it comes to podcasting?
That's a great point. And there's probably something also, probably some data behind that too, because I know there is data behind the the video part.
The
And that's the
video,
reason
yeah.
why the most popular videos, like people that are great content creators on YouTube, aren't just great content creators. They don't just put together silly things or whatever it might be. They put together hit videos that are watched by millions of people because they have a formula. And one of the aspects
Mhm.
of that formula that you'll always see is that video is never longer than 10 minutes. And it's
Right.
sometimes it's only up to maybe 5 minutes, depending upon the type of content, because you want to be dynamic, hit your audience, and then let them go and then go reflect and go talk about your video and share it, etc., whatever it might be. Let them have it in those smaller chunks. I bet it's this very similar to Mary with audio, though. I think we break every single rule in podcasting, the OnEducation one. And some people have called us out on that and just joking around with us, but it's true
Mhm.
that our podcast is really long compared to other people's podcasts because we have probably a 25 to 30 minutes chit chat between me and Mike that has various different educational topics. At first, it starts off with just us chatting about life.
Yeah.
And then we talk about some educational topics, and then we transition to our guests. Um,
Mhm.
and our guest interviews are somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes usually. So the total time of the podcast usually is close to an hour. And so that's intimidating
Mhm.
to some people because they're like, I don't have an hour, I don't have an hour of whatever it might be. And most podcasts aren't that long. And most
Yeah.
educational podcasts that I've noticed are really 30 minutes or less. And I think
Yeah.
that's probably a really smart move by those, like the way that they're breaking theirs down, just because it's easily, most of us, when we drive into work, it's only possibly up to 30 minutes,
Half an
or,
hour.
or back and forth. It might be a total of 30 minutes. When you go for a walk, it might be a 30-minute walk. So it kind of fits that time
Mhm.
period. But there are people like us, or like Joe Rogan, who has like a 4-hour podcast, where it's a
Yeah.
super long, really long things that you could just, and it kind of reminds me, those longer ones remind me more of turning on the radio to AM radio,
Yeah.
and then listening to, AM radio talk shows, and it's like
Yeah.
these long 3-hour segments of whatever it might be. And some of us get into that, too.
Yeah.
So for sure, for your students, though, I would say smaller and tighter creative chunks are going to be way better for them.
Mhm. Mhm. Thanks, Glenn. I was wondering about that from that angle too. I would say most of the ones that I listen to are about an hour. I think most of my favorite ones are about an hour. And what I'll do is sometimes it's split up into two different walks. If I take, 30-minute one day and then I'll listen to the second half the next day, whatever. Excuse me, my phone's ringing, which it never does
No problem.
except when I'm on doing something and I don't want it to
This is
ring.
this is this is our typical
Um,
life right now, yes.
that's right. Oh my gosh. We're nearing the top of the hour, so I just want to give anybody in the audience a chance, if
Sure,
you
for
have a
sure.
question for Glenn, to go ahead and ask it. And I'll wait a minute or so for that if you want to unmute or put it in the chat. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to go ahead and put up the share on my screen again. And Glenn, do you see anything coming into the chat?
I do. Oh, and in the
Okay,
chat?
go ahead. Yep,
No,
go
not in
ahead.
the chat. Nope.
Nope.
No questions in the
I,
chat.
I
Sorry.
I don't
Okay,
want to monopolize everything,
No,
but
go ahead,
I
Raymond.
would ask another question.
go ahead, Raymond.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I like that idea, that half hour podcast. I couldn't keep mine below an hour. I did my best to always keep it an hour. I want to know, as far as marketing, because I was always just trying to get the word out there. I was doing Facebook blasts, and that's how I was going about marketing. And then, of course, I started out with my staff and then my community, and then I would market out in the areas of the guests I had. What are
Yes.
some other strategies you used, Glenn, so that you could get word out about your podcast?
A lot of it was, again, I got to give Mike a lot of credit. He already had in mind some of the things that need to be done if you wanted to grow and really grow quickly, he had in mind that there were some things that needed to be done ahead of time. So, for example, even our logo, he's a great um, creator of different types of things as far as logo wise, graphic designer. That's what I'm trying to say. So he created the logo and our website and all of this things. He had those things ready to go even before we even press play on the first kind of episodes. He already had kind of our marketing tag as far as like what the podcast was going to be about, um, and then to spread the message, we did the same kind of similar things that you're talking about. We pushed out tons of things to social media to some of our friends. We had tons of people listen in to our episode 0, which never got published. It's like the fake episode, the first episode, and then give us feedback on that. But then once the first episode came out, they helped us to spread the word and for example, give us reviews on Apple Podcasts, and we were fortunate tons of people did that, and then helped us to, these lists are very difficult to get onto. I mean, they're ridiculously difficult to be able to get onto any of these kind of the top 10 Apple lists or the Google playlist or whatever it might be. But we were fortunate because of a combination of people listening to the podcast and then people writing reviews, uh, to kind of get that message spread out. But you're exactly right. That's great marketing. You target your obviously everybody that you know, and then your guests know a lot of other people, and then we always talk to our guests and say, hey, our episode's going to come out on so and so day. We're going to tag you, and we're going to share anything that you want to share about anything, even promotion wise for you, the guest. But if you would please do us this favor too, and then share this again with your audiences. And some of our biggest names, I mean, Jordan Shapiro has been interviewed by every news outlet out there. So I'm talking about been on NBC, Fox News, every news media resource, USA Today, the New York Times, and everything else in between. But that guy is always willing to get his episode, share it with his hundreds of thousands of people that go ahead and follow him both on Twitter and on Facebook. And he's always talking our podcast up, though we're like, on the scheme of the list of things, we're like nobody, but we super appreciate people that we're like, thank you so much for doing it. You don't have to, but I think he and several of our guests are just, you know, they're willing to just spend a little bit of their time and then be able to share with their audiences too. So that's a great connection too. You're exactly right.
Yeah, I would just just a couple final things before we wrap up. For those of you who might be new to podcasts, in the slide deck, excuse me, I have links here to finding them on Google Play and also on Apple. You can also just Google podcasts on Google or one of your search engines and come up with quite a few options there. And then I just put together a short list of some of the ones that I really enjoy from the education perspective. Of course, top of my list is OnEducation. But then as an example of what a local school district is doing, Elk River Public Schools has one out there on the Avid Open Access Network for teachers. So Raymond, you might want to check that one out if you're looking for ideas of what to do, for your district in Eden Prairie. And then just a few more of my favorites. The Unearthed, Brad Gustafson, he is a principal out in Minnetonka Public Schools who speaks a lot on leadership. He's growing in popularity as well. And I did add in Glenn's document, a link to Glenn's document that he shared with us. So you have all that in the slide deck as well. And then I just found an interesting article the other day about the top 50 podcasts, according to Time Magazine. So some popular ones. that are out there. So they're very easy to find, and you can listen to them on your phone. I often play them on the computer as well. And sometimes they do have a video component to them as well, depending on who's making them, that you can watch or not watch, depending on where you are. So I just wanted to share those few things out before we stop today. Glenn, do you have any parting comments that you'd like to offer our audience before we wind it up?
Yeah, I was just going to say that if anybody is interested in anything else or has further questions, we did also Mike and I had the opportunity of, at the Impact Education Conference, of doing a workshop related to this process. I just kind of talked through some of the things, but we have some materials that we're more than willing to share about the process of starting from nothing, as far as the podcast itself, and then going all the way to where we are currently, it kind of little steps, talking about branding, even if you're interested in those types of things. And that's part of a presentation that we are more than happy to go ahead and share with anybody, and everything else in between. You could talk to myself or to Mike. And if you want to get on a call, let's do it. Yes, I'm more than happy to go ahead and jump on there with you and get you going, whether it's for your students or for yourself. Either way.
That's great, Glenn. Should they reach out to you on the OnEducation website? What's the best way to get hold of you?
For me, it's Twitter.
Okay.
So at Irv Spanish is I always, and if you follow me, I will follow you back. If we don't already follow each other, and then you could direct message me. People direct message me all the time with whatever it might be. And then, or it's just Glen Irvin at Gmail is like my personal email too. So just my name at Gmail. You can more than welcome to email me, whatever questions. Usually I'm sharing resources related, like I said, to things that I did as far as my Spanish classroom. But we have other things, experiences and things that we've learned along the way as far as in the podcasting process, we're more than happy to share too.
Okay. Glenn, thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your wisdom on podcasting. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and wind us up now. We're a little bit over the hour, but thank you for joining us and hanging in. And Glenn, thanks so much and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.